Today I'm gonna talk about a technique I used to use. I don't really know what it's officially called because I didn't research it or anything. It's just something I came up with eventually after studying esports for a long time, specifically StarCraft 2. I call it imaging. And basically, what imaging is, it's my way of doing predictive analysis. So back when I was a StarCraft 2 writer for Team Liquid, I did a lot of previews, and in previews, generally you could do it in like two ways, where you do like the narrative, and then you do like the analysis part where you make the predictions of who you think is going to win and why you think they're going to win. And eventually, I had watched so many games and so many tournaments of StarCraft 2. I eventually came to this technique, and I no longer use it because none of my writing is really based off of doing predictive analysis or anything. But it's a pretty interesting technique, or a pretty interesting way of thinking about the game, and it works in any game basically. So I thought I'd talk about it, and anybody else who wants to use it can, or or whatever. So basically, the way I do imaging is you have to figure out first the two. Obviously, you have to figure out what the matchup is, or who the players are, and then look at their statistics. And generally, what I mean by statistics is it isn't just enough just to look at their win rate on win rate in certain matchups like TVZ, TVT, or TVP, and it isn't enough to look at their map win rates, like how many times they win on a certain map. You also need to know the general ways they win each map by percentage rate. So for instance, I think Innovation during his prime had something around 70% win rate in like TVZs, and almost, I'd say, I'm pretty sure about like 90% of those wins all came in through the mid game, late game, and they were all done by crushing mechanics. Whereas let's go to somebody else that has completely different. Okay, so if you want, you can go to Curious from StarTale to Curious, from a Zerg player. Like, he was pretty good from 2011 to 2012. That was around his peak era, and he also had a very high win rate at the time. I think it might have been around 60 to 70% ish, because that was like one of his good forms. Like, he wasn't that great of a player, but every once in a while he had a very good form. But what made him very complicated to predict or analyze was the fact that even though he was having a lot of high win rates in like ZVT or ZVP, the problem with trying to predict what he was going to do was that he always used a different strategy in every game. So basically, what made him so strong during that particular period was the fact that he had a standard game, but it only came out, I'd say, 1 out of 5 games, and then the other 4 out of 5 games were all either like unorthodox strategies, old strategies, or like various types of cheese, which wasn't actually very helpful, because you can't really put cheese in one category, because there's like 1 base, 2 base, and like a fake 3 base types of cheese that Curious could do. So that was always like a problem with trying to predict him. And so that's kind of what I mean by statistics, where it isn't just enough to like go on like a statistics website like AliGulak, or I guess in the later part of the video I'll be talking about CSGO. It isn't enough just go to like HLTV. You have to figure out how these statistics are gathered, and then you have to figure out how you can apply them into like the modeling of your game, or the modeling of the player, or how it applies to a specific person or matchup. So a few other examples, I guess, because I'll be talking about them later, will be Innovate. So I'll be talking about 4 players from StarCraft 2 in terms of like how I'd model them using this imaging thing. So Innovation, Tasia, Life, and SOS are pretty good. So first you have to you look at the statistics, and then you figure out how are they winning a bunch of these maps. And if you look at like Tasia, almost all of his map wins, actually, yeah, I'd say it's very similar to Innovation, but whereas Innovation would crush you with mechanics, Like Tasia, he was much more likely to take you to the mid game or late game, but he'd let you make the mistake first. He played a very passive style, so he would the essential problem with playing Tasia for every other player was the fact that Tasia would never overextend. He would only take fights that were either 100% guaranteed maybe he would take a risk, but the only time he'd take a risk is if he knew he had to win the game. And that's why he became such a like extraordinarily hard player to play against. And then the complete opposite of that is the next player I'll talk about, which is Life. His like player identity, so to speak, was he was very aggressive, very gambly, very instinctive. He had an incredible sense of intuition, of mental weakness, of aggression that has never been replicated before or since. So if you want to model his games, generally speaking, he also had very high win rates for very specific periods, but a majority of his wins either all of them came from different periods, like early game, mid game, late game, but they all generally came from the same idea, which is he'd basically backstab you or like distract you and then attack you. He was never the type to like macro a huge army like DRG or Nesty and then fight it out. He could do that style, but he rarely did it because what would happen is he would always take the initiative. Like a majority of his games, I'd say like at least 70 to 80% are him taking the initiative and then running around the other guy and then beating him that way. And then the final guy I'll talk about is SOS. And SOS, if you want to talk about him, I feel like a majority of his wins come from the fact that nobody besides himself and like the players who he practices with for prolonged periods of time. So like Sulky probably knows him pretty well, but basically players like that are a player like SOS is very hard to predict exactly what he will do. He will rarely use a standard build, but he'll use an orthodox build, and this is part of why he is so good in weekender tournaments like BlizzCon, the IEM, winner take all, those types, is because it's very hard to deal with that if you aren't prepared for it, and because his style is so unique, like so off the wall, so crazy, but it's also very clever and very smart. The problem with dealing with SOS is for a majority of players, like like their standard style and what they'll do. For SOS, you know what he'll do, but you have to really study him to like really break down you have to break down like his tendencies and how he plays. And so it made him very hard to play off the cuff, but it made him like more manageable during like long preparation tournaments, and that's obviously why he was never nearly as successful in GSL as he was in the Weekenders. So I've talked about statistics and how you have to break those down. I've talked about the identity of the player. Then you talk about the maps, and basically the maps are generally how you think about what type of map is the player good on. I'd say, for instance, Innovation and Life had very mid-range maps, which is like maps that allow for fast marches for Innovation or Life, or allow like a lot of different pathways for Life. Tasia was an expert on very large maps and medium maps, where like I'd say larger maps were Tasia's expertise, because what happened is you naturally go to the late game, and the longer you extend the game, the more likely the opponent is to make a mistake, and Tasia is a master of capitalizing on these mistakes and letting you like fuck up. He's very patient in that way. So like even Rain, who I consider one of the greatest macro protosses of all time, was like he couldn't like touch Tasia in its prime. Like the one time they played at the WCS season 2, where like basically Tasia spent like 20 minutes sniping 40 observers, and then like frustrated Rain finally made a bad move, and then Tasia instantly won. It was something along those lines. SOS doesn't really have SOS. This is why this is another reason why he's complicated to play. He doesn't have a range of maps. His range of maps don't really matter generally, as long as the meta on the map itself isn't too strict. So what I mean by that is there's not a very obvious or very certain way you have to play the map based off of the architecture of the map, where like you have to wall in or you instantly die. So Alterzime, Daedalus, I think it was like maps where like it's impossible for the Protoss to live if they don't wall in, or like maps where like it's very obviously bad. So long as the map itself is open and like he can make something happen, generally speaking. And there are certain maps where like the Pro League maps, for example, where I think SOS probably shines because his unorthodox style and his like cleverness and his smarts make him a very hard opponent to play in that sense for anybody. Right. So now we go down to so now I've talked about the stats, the identity, like the maps they play on, and then you go down to like the general tactics. And this is a very odd one because I've kind of already like run down exactly how they want to play in general. So you have to understand. So this part, I guess you'd have to understand how the tactics match up against each other. So let's take, for instance, Innovation and Tasia. Innovation and Tasia, then both players will rarely play an early game, right? Play an early game like strategy where they try to end it instantly. So you go to the mid game, and what happens in the mid game? They'll both be building up. They might jockey for map control. No, they will almost certainly jockey for map control, but it won't be fully committed. And then you go into the late game, and this is generally how it's going to work. Is Innovation will try to push down and attack Tasia. And what Tasia will do is he will like he'll let it come. He'll like hold it. He'll like basically like force it to slowly siege in, while at the same time he'll be attacking the map across the map or flanking around the side and trying to destroy the army. And that's generally like the Tasia style, is to play like the large macro game, to play the positioning game, to play the economic game that way. So he's never really the offender. He's never really the aggressor until it's very obvious where he has like an advantage where he can take a hold of. So for instance, if Innovation attack first, which he will, Tasia, he will stop the attack. He might make multi-pronged drops. He might flank the army, but once that's done, he will instantly like, because Innovation has committed so many forces on the outside, he will instantly attack a point of interest on the map that either is like economically very important for Innovation, or a point of position that allows Tasia to then from that point siege allows him multiple avenues of attack. And that's generally how like those two players have played out throughout their career. So for Innovation Life, for instance, this is a very complicated one where Life, like I said, he will play in the early game, mid game, late game. So if you're thinking about the way Innovation plays, if you feel like if it goes into the early game, Life will naturally have an advantage, because the way of Life's tactics is he will backstab you, he will like trick you, he'll make a bunch of these aggressive moves that are fairly hard for Innovation to deal with. But even in like a mid game, late game, like I said, Innovation's more of a bulldozer than he is like a finesse type player. And Life has the mechanics to match Innovation, but he also has the finesse to like outplay Innovation. So it becomes a very hard sort of mess in that sense, because basically what's happening is basically like Innovation is like fist, and then Tasia would be paper. But in the case of Innovation and Life, they're like both, it's basically kind of like a knife fight to see who kills each other first. And that's why when these two players play, it gets kind of like ugly. It gets generally ugly. And generally speaking, if Life's counterattack somehow brings Innovation back home, that's almost always an indication that Innovation lost. Because what's going to happen is, if Innovation is forced back home, and if he doesn't take the attack, Innovation will lose part of his army, but he'll lose all of his economy, whereas Life's economy and mechanics will mean that he will be able to replenish and rebuild his army, and it becomes an impossible like task for Innovation to win. And that's generally why I've always favored Life in that particular matchup. But it's very dependent on, it is dependent upon form, and it is dependent upon meta. So for instance, like Innovation, like I talked earlier about his stats, like another way to look at it is, another like specific stat I look at is series wins or tournament wins, and all of Innovation's stats are almost directly correlated to his strength of Terran in the patch. which isn't to say like he's a bad player. It's more to say that he's the best at the standard style, and so long as the standard theoretical style is the best, he is also the best, and that's why he's like one of the great players, right? So that's also another thing to consider when you think about innovation in life. Maybe perhaps meta is so strong for innovation, is strong enough for innovation that will be enough of an edge for him to run over life. And then you go to somebody like Tasia versus Life. This is another really complicated matchup because, like I said, Life is super aggressive, like counterattacky, but Tasia doesn't do these aggressive pushes. So exactly how is Life going to catch him off guard? So eventually, what's going to happen is Life can either try for like the early aggressive explosion all in, which is part of his playbook, or he might go into the mid game because eventually, no matter what, Tasia has to, because of the way TVZ works, Tasia must contend with the creep spread because if you let the creep spread, the mobility and the information given to the Zerg player is way too much, especially for a player like Life who can take advantage of that and create flanks, create counterattacks. Basically, it exponentially increases the threat of Life's attributes, like his specialties. So Tasia will So basically, here's the way Tasia will play Life in a theoretical sense in terms of tactics. Tasia will go to the very edge of the creep. He will scan it, and then he'll kill the creep tumors, and then he'll back off. He'll let the creep recede, and then he'll keep repeating this over and over again. At the same time, Life will pump fake Tasia's army. So for instance, because basically what's happening is Tasia's army is on the very edge of creep, so the two of them are basically pump faking each other the entire time, because Tasia wants Life to overcommit and step off the creep, whereas Life wants Tasia to overcommit and step onto the creep. So they're basically always like forcing each other into these very odd, very calculated scenarios on the very edges of their domains, so to speak. But at the same time, Life will split off his forces and attack the backsides of Tasia. But the problem with dealing with Tasia is he's actually prepared for this because he himself doesn't necessarily commit all of his forces, because he will never get into a position where he needs all those forces because he's never actually pushing onto creep. So the two of them will always be fighting these very hard, very economical battles, and this is why the two of them have such epic games against each other, is because of their like strategies, their identities are so like polarizing that it becomes impossible to say which will come out, because basically what's happening is you have Life with the greatest offense and Tasia with the greatest defense. So it always switches between the two of them as to who is going to win at any particular time. Like the only time I felt like it was a runover was during like 2012, but that was also during the age of Broodlord Infestor, so I'll give that a pass. And as for SOS, like this is where like tactics don't really apply to SOS, because SOS will do the same thing to everybody, but everybody will react like a similar way to SOS, where like it's very hard for them to get a read on SOS in any particular moment. So he'll always do like a bunch of weird things, and this was true from all of Heart of the Swarm. So the final aspect, I guess, I'll talk about is mentality. And what I mean by mentality is obviously this has to come into play generally this only comes into play for very specific people, very specific matchups, very specific tournaments. So for instance, like I think earlier I didn't really call Marine King a Kong because he didn't have pressure. He didn't feel, it wasn't so much that he was pressured and then underperformed so much as he was always just that bad. Like he shouldn't have won most of those. But I will say he did have like a mental case against MVP by the very end, where like looking at MVP like really did make him underperform horrifically, right? So that's like a specific matchup. If talking about specific moments, obviously Sue comes into mind because like it's kind of weird talking about Sue because like it's not like he completely underperforms in finals, but he never reaches his like full power, and then like the other guy like overpowers him, and that's all. So he's obviously another guy who obviously has a mental problem, and that's something you have to keep in mind when you're doing the analysis, the predictive analysis of imaging. And so basically I've talked about, and I think that covers it. So I've talked about stats. I've talked about like the identity or style. I've talked about maps, and then the tactics on those the tactics and the mentality, and then you combine all of that together, and then you basically your mind you run a matchup in your head about 10 times. That's generally what I do. Is I run like a scenario in my head about 10 times, and then generally I will come to like a conclusion about a particular matchup where I think who do I think is more likely to win in like, and if they played each other 10 times on the same map, assuming of course that they don't get the same information, like information doesn't carry over. So this is why I've always felt Tasia would always be innovation, because Tasia's like very very play style is a natural fit to defeat innovation, even though innovation I consider a very strong, very good player, like one of the greats. And the reason for that is, like I said, is like a very stylistic thing where like the very small edge that Tasia gains in like the mid game or late game should always put him ahead like the majority of the time. So I always thought that was in 10 matches I feel like Tasia should win 7 or 8 of those. Whereas like Innovation Life I felt like it was a 50-50. Tasia Life was a 50-50. SOS versus anyone is like it's a very hard sell in any case, so it's like a very hard sell, and it actually is dependent upon the preparation. So I feel like SOS during high pressure moments is much higher to succeed in a weekender than he is in like a, let's say, round of 16 group in GSL or something, right? So those are some ways I've thought about it. So basically, I take all the information and then I run a scenario in my head over and over and over again until I come to like a conclusion as to how this should play out a majority of the time. And the reason you do this imaging is because basically what's going to happen is you're going to realize that like there are some players who don't have the consistency to play out the same way every single time. So for instance, who is a very erratic player? All right, so one of the most erratic players, I guess, is Dream. Dream, for those who don't know, is like an SKT. It was like formerly an SKT Terran. Before that, he was on MVP. He was responsible for basically ruining Life's early run in early 2016. Basically, Life was killing everybody, and the only person who was able to stop him was Dream, and Dream did it twice. And this is a very shocking sort of series, because if we're talking about statistics, Dream has like a success rate of playing at the top level of about like, in his entire career, it's got to be like maybe 5%, 10% of the time. Like his entire career, each year, he will literally get like 10% of the year where he's very good, and the rest of the year is complete trash. So it was actually kind of shocking for Dream to play Life at that level, because the reason Dream's like, if you want to think about Dream, he's a very good example of a player with an incredibly high ceiling, arguably like one of the highest ceilings you'll ever see of a Terran player, but like the consistency rate of what he could put out at the highest ceiling was so freakishly low that it was basically like a bolt of lightning. Like it might come once or twice a year, but that's it. That's all you're gonna get out of Dream. And the reason like his style was so freakish was because it was like a combination of like the Tasia and Maru style, where he had this incredibly high finesse, high mechanics, but he also had like the positioning. He also had like the positioning of Tasia, so it became like he had like the aggression of innovation. He had like the multitasking of Maru and his like macro and mechanical ability, and he had like Tasia's ability to position, and like game sense was pretty high at specific moments. So, and he needed all of those in order to like overcome Life during that period where Life was super dominant. So that's a player who should have won. Like if I put him head to head against Life before I saw those matches, I'd say he only had like a 2 out of 10 chance, and that's why those matches are so shocking, so like upset making. Like basically, like they're half miraculous and half like a testament to how good his Dream's overall skill ceiling was. And that's why he's such a incredible. He was like at moments such an incredible player to watch. And of course, like there are also certain players who are just gonna like completely wreck this model. MVP did it obviously because like MVP like before prior to every like tournament every matchup basically all factors should have pointed to MVP losing for the entirety of 2012, but he kept winning or he kept like doing very well. And the reason for that was because he was basically changing his identity, and he's changing the tactics every time, and like he was reading the mentality of the other players, so it became very hard. So like basically like he kind of ruins the system in the sense that he's able to like change from moment to moment. I mean from like tournament to tournament, he was able to reinvent himself. He was basically able to reinvent the game in order for him to play at that level, and that's why he's such a incredible player. All right, so now I'm gonna bring up an example from a different game, CS:GO, and I'm not gonna choose a matchup that's already happened. I'll choose one that hasn't happened yet. So I think Astralis versus SK among the super teams haven't played out yet. So here's like how the imaging would work. I think for certain instance like statistics, if I could find them, the statistics I'd want going into this matchup is generally the success rate of SK winning whenever Fur and Cold Zero drop a certain amount of kills in a match or have a certain amount of ADR, and then like the stats I'd want from the Astralis side is like how many times does Astralis close round if Device gets like the first opening pick, something like that. Those would be the stats I'd be looking for, and then you kind of match them up and see exactly what's going on, because I feel like those are the three biggest factors going into a match between Astralis versus SK is Device, and on the other side it would be Cold Zero and Fur. Now this is actually a very specific thing, but if it was the finals, you also have to put in the Kirby. You'd have to figure out exactly like statistically how impactful he was, how much impact he has somehow, and that's like another guy you look out for, because I feel like Kirby is incredible under pressure. He's like a very very very, very good player, so he's like another guy I'd watch out for in terms of like stats you'd be looking for. In terms of team identity, then Astralis, what kind of team is Astralis? I feel like Astralis is a very strong standard team. They had their general rule set. They're very structured, and their general way of playing is team based. It's execution based, and it's based off of Device and his op and the way he plays the op and how like that op functions into the system basically. So that's generally how I describe Astralis. They have like a combination of skill, tactics, and like very strong basics that make them very hard to beat. And then how do I describe SK right now? I feel like SK is a very skill heavy team. And not only is it a skill heavy team, I feel like it has so Astralis, for instance, is very balanced in terms of aggression and passive play. Aggression and passive play. For instance, like Kirby is pretty aggressive, Glaive is pretty aggressive, whereas in contrast to that, Zitnix, Dupree are more on the passive side, and Device is generally like, I feel like he's more passive, but he's very calculated when he takes the aggressive angles. So he like he'll very rarely ever like get picked out, generally speaking. Whereas if you want to talk about SK, I feel like they have three aggressive elements in their team: Fur, Phelps, and Fallen. And then they have two passive elements in their team, which is like Cold Zero and Taco. And it's not even necessarily the case, because I think like both of them could play the aggressive role, but they're like lowest on the priority because they don't need to. Basically, all the aggression roles are taken by the other three, and that's always been like that was like their initial problem, was trying to balance out these roles. And right now I think they have a good mix of generally getting like Fur the biggest priority, and then it's Phelps and Fallen depending on like the situation of the map, which side they're on, weaponry, stuff like this. So how do these team identities match up? It'll also, I actually can't say in a theoretical sense, but I can say but it's easier to just look at it in terms of like, because all right, it's hard to say exactly how they match up, but basically you're depending upon like consistency, right? And I feel like Astralis is very consistent. You'll know generally what you'll get. But the current version iteration of SK is also very consistent because I don't feel like Fur's ever dropped off. I feel like Cold Zero's only had one bad tournament so far, ESL Pro League. So I feel like in terms of consistency, they're pretty similar-ish. So now we come down to the maps. And maps, this isn't my specialty, so I'm just guessing, or not guessing, but this is what I think they do. I think Astralis will ban Cobble because they don't like Cobble. SK is pretty good on Cobble. SK will ban Nuke because they don't play Nuke. And then Astralis should, I think, pick Overpass because I feel that Overpass is their best map. And it's like something like SK has shown some weakness on. SK will probably pick Mirage because Astralis has banned that map, and Astralis is like just okay-ish on Mirage. Astralis will then have the choice between Cash, Train, and Inferno to ban. And obviously, Cash is the one they should ban because I feel SK is really good on Cash. So ban that, and then SK have a choice between Train and Inferno, and this is very hard to say because I feel like they like both maps. They like both maps in the medium, but if I was them, I'd probably ban Train. I feel like Astralis is still very good on Train. So then go to Inferno. All right, so here's how. So basically, you have a map pool of Overpass, Mirage, and Inferno. So how does Overpass play out? So basically, you have to redo the entire thing in terms of like how does the team identity work into this map? How do the tactics work into this map? And then how do they match up? Let me check my notes. So basically, if Astralis start on CT side, how do they match up against SK's T side? So how do Astralis like run the CT side? Generally speaking, they will get Device the op, and then he will be the one like controlling the middle area, or long, I guess. And let's see. And then they'll have like a bunch of different like aggressive setups. So for instance, they'll do like a two long one mid push sometimes, or sometimes they might just counter like a B very fast B execution early by stacking 4 on B before like spreading out doing the default. Generally speaking, like Dupree might do a monster push. Like these are like very general things they might be doing. These are all things you have to consider when you run into like SK's Overpass. And SK's Overpass is very it's not as good as it once was. Actually, it's very meh. It's like it feels like they lost like the structure they needed in order to do like the very old style that made them so successful, which was taking like a map quadrant by quadrant, and then once they got close, they'd execute onto A or B on like the very last seconds of the map. So that's kind of why I feel like Astralis will win out, because SK don't have like the structure. They don't have the old style of structure, and they don't really have. And like their B executes aren't that great. So if you're thinking about it in terms of Astralis CT side to SKT side, I feel Astralis went out. So what happens in the reverse then? SK CT side to Astralis T side. SK CT side is a bit better. I feel like Fallen and Fur are very good right now as holding that side, but like Phelps is kind of like not lost cause, but it's more like he's the lost piece because he doesn't really fit here. So basically he's generally putting like underpass, or he's putting like the rotator position, or like Cold and Taco are put on B. And he doesn't have like the supportive ability of something like FNX, which is why SK was so dominant last year at the end because of Fallen, actually, because like Fallen was basically a god. So it became very obvious that everybody's going to be eventually, because you can't deal with Fallen. But in this particular case, I feel like Astralis do have the structure to take over the map quadrant by quadrant, and it's based off of like Device like slowly taking up long, slowly taking up middle, So like they're slowly taking it up. And then the other problem is like they have a very strong B execute. So basically, they'll just keep doing the slow like A map control style over and over and over again, and then all of a sudden they'll get like one or two like important rounds off of their B execute, and so Astralis will win both the CT side and T side, and this is why I think it's a heavily Astralis favorite map for in this particular matchup. So if you think about it that way, then if you image it in your mind, what exactly does SK need to win this? I feel like you need an exceptional, like not even just like a regular good one, but like an exceptional performance from Fur and coldzera. And yeah, they're very good, but like an exceptional one is basically like godlike, or you might need a godlike performance from Fallen just to win one side of the map. So I'd say 7 times out of 10, probably Astralis will win Overpass against SK. So you go to the second map. Second map was, in this theoretical scenario, it's Mirage. All right. Now, Mirage, I feel, is much more SK-sided compared to Astralis because Mirage currently is not as good for the op as it was in the past because of the on CT side, because everybody does the window smoke now, so it becomes harder for somebody like Device to get to like control that area. So it kind of goes default into like into the terrorist's hands, kind of. And this isn't necessarily a problem because I feel Astralis have very good retakes. But here's the problem: is if you run SK's T side against Astralis' CT side, Astralis have a pretty good like default. They have some like some aggressive options, like Dupree might do something, or they have like some funny setups, or like put 2 in cat and 1 middle or something, or they try to help Device, like maybe he's in middle, maybe he's like pushing connector, maybe he's like boosted at B on the bench. But basically, like these are all right, these are pretty good. But when you're running into SK's T side on Mirage, you're gonna have an obvious problem. That problem is gonna be Phelps. Like even if you're, because basically, I feel like their mid control is very good. SK side, so they take mid control and then they can execute on A or they can execute on B. But the essential problem is their best player on this map is probably Phelps. And what'll happen is they'll boost Phelps into the window, and then he'll create havoc, and he'll make the retake much harder for the CT side to make happen. And so basically that's why I'd probably favor SK's T side against Astralis' CT side. Now you flip over the side. So SK's CT side, I feel, is very good actually. And the reason SK's CT side is very good is because they have two very aggressive, or I guess three very aggressive players. They have Fallen, who can match like Device in terms of opping on this side. Then they have Fur. And the problem with Fur for Astralis is that Fur is super aggressive, but he's super aggressive in like a multitude of ways. So he can run up under into like B. He can run up straight in middle. He can run out ramp. Like you don't really know exactly when he's coming out. The only thing you know is he is coming. And in addition to that, like coldzera and like Taco, they might push B at the same time, or the B halls at the same time, or sometimes they'll do like a three like middle retake with like Fur, Fallen, and Phelps. It's very like there's like a bunch of aggressive options here. Like even if Fur falls, then you have like Phelps who can do the aggression. So it becomes like a very wild, very dangerous like side for Astralis to handle. And that's why, and I feel like they do this in such, SK do this in such consistency that you can depend on guys like Fur and Phelps to just go take these duels and then win them a lot of the times. So because of that, you'd have to favor SK's CT side against like Astralis' T side on this particular map. So in this map, for instance, I'd say SK should win 6 or 7 times out of 10 against Astralis, because I feel like they basically have like the tools in terms of like tactics, in terms of like team identity. They have the tools needed to dominate this map, whereas Astralis are kind of lacking because they don't have a guy who's like super crazy aggressive like Fur. Actually, I don't think there are very many guys in the world who are super crazy aggressive like Fur. So I feel like I feel like the existence of fur here is very very hard to handle. And then like for instance, like I said, Astralis is very good at retake. So is SK, and SK has, if they go on A, SK has Coldzera to retake, and that's like a very difficult proposition for anyone. And if they go B, they just run directly into Coldzera, and that's a problem too, because what's happening is Coldzera will like kill a bunch of people. Taco will stay alive, and then like Fur or Fells will be backstabbing you. It's like an entire problem. So that's why I'd favor SK. Like if you run this map a bunch of times in my head, I generally think SK will win majority of the time. So 6 out of 10 times, 7 out of 10 times, right? And then the last map is probably Inferno. It's my guess. I'm not actually sure if that'll be the case if they ever play. So you go to Inferno, and I feel like Inferno as a map currently, you need a very structured T side, and the reason I feel this way is because I've watched G2 a bunch of times, and I feel like the T side is pretty bad. And the reason I feel it's pretty bad is because they don't really have the executes, and they don't really have like the ability to control the map in a very good way. And that's generally like how you can kind of tell like Kenny S, Shocks, Apex, MBK, they all have like bad skill, but they can't really adjust to it. So in terms of team identity, then who has the more structured side? Who has the more structured style between Astralis and SK? I feel Astralis right now definitely has a stronger like structure to it to do these kinds of plays. And in that case, I feel Astralis' T side will be stronger than SK's T side, because another thing about Inferno is there aren't as many avenues of attack for somebody like Fur or Phelps to take advantage of. So they just have to go in and bop heads generally, and that's all they can do. That is not as effective, right? So if we're gonna talk about Inferno, I guess we'll also talk about our CT side. And even though this isn't a map Astralis generally play, I feel like their CT side is actually still pretty good. Like Device as an opper still has a pretty good impact. He could be at B, he could be at apartments, he could be mid. He'll do all of that stuff, and they have like pretty good setup. They have pretty good setups. The way they take banana is, or the way they play banana is like they'll basically like take control of it and then leave Device there, or is it Nyx there, and then either one of them play well enough that they won't ever get taken out. If SK ever like do take banana control, they'll just fall back and then they call the rotation over. So that's also a problem, because basically what's happening is in order to take banana control from one of them, you're like wasting a bunch of utility, and then they can maybe retake it, or maybe like somebody like Kirby on the other side like pushes forward, gets the information, or Dupree maybe, like stuff like this. So I feel like Astralis' CT side will be favored against SK's T side, and then SK's CT side is still in flux. Like they haven't really figured out how they want to play this, because they have like a bunch of aggressive like players, but like they don't really have the great synergy yet on B. I think like right now, let me check. Like they've basically changed a few of the positions a few times. So right now they're playing like Fallen and Fur on B, but before that they were playing Fallen and Cold on B, I think, because basically and before that they were playing like Cold and Taco. So it feels like their CT side has yet to mesh together as they want it to, and they have like some aggressive like elements to them. Like Fur and Phelps can obviously take over apartments, obviously like take over mid every once in a while, but that's not something you can generally rely on, especially against players that are on Astralis. So on this particular map, I feel like you have to also favor Astralis' T side against SK's CT side. So, but here's the thing: is neither of them are really specialists on this map. So in this particular map, even though I favor Astralis slightly, I'd say it's like not as much as the others. It'd probably be like 55 or 60, I guess. And I feel like a great performance from a player on either team could be enough to like push one team over the edge, assuming there isn't like a matching player on the other side. So that's generally how the imaging works basically you create a bunch of information you think is relevant to a particular matchup. So in my case, I generally take like reinterpreted stats, the player identity / team identity. Then you go to the maps, and then you see how their identity is played out in the tactics and how they match up. And then you go into mentality. I didn't really talk about mentality here because I don't think it applies to SK versus Astralis. I feel like basically Astralis have proven they've at least proven to me that they can play under high pressure situations, and all of them can do this. Like, I thought Device was amazing at the finals where they played FaZe and lost, for instance. So basically there are like no problems for either side, and I don't really think so much as like on the flip side, I guess like Dupree and Glaive had problems, but I feel like that's kind of what you expect from them. Like, it's not that they're underperforming as so much as they were never like the current iteration of their forms isn't necessarily that consistent that they'll always show up, and that's fine because they're not the star players of the team. But that's like, but in terms of like the other side, I feel like SK won't necessarily always show up. The other guys that will for sure is Fur and Cold. So, but I guess Phelps is pretty good, and then Taco always does his role. So I guess this is what I said last time, but I feel like Fallen, if he actually does become consistent, this team SK is super fucking dangerous to everybody in the world. Like, they have what it takes maybe to be number one. We'll see. But basically, that's it for how I use imaging and predictive analysis. It's not something I actually do nowadays because obviously none of my articles are about stuff like this. But it's a pretty fun thought exercise, and it's generally how I think about a specific matchup if I ever have time to just sit down and write it up. All right, later.